the United Kingdom attacked Russia. But the sound of this attack didn't come from explosions. It echoed from somewhere else, quieter, more strategic, and infinitely more disturbing. No shot was fired. No plane crossed the skies. And yet, the damage was done. The move was precise, silent, and planned far from the battlefields. A strike that didn't hit the body, but the backbone of a nation. What exactly was done? How do you strike a power without raising weapons? And the big question, could an attack without gunfire be more devastating than any declared confrontation? Today you're going to understand why this might be one of the most ingenious and dangerous attacks of recent times, and how it turned out to be devastating for Vladimir Putin. To fully grasp this story, we need to go back not just to February 2022, but even further, to 2014. That's when the UK and its allies started putting the first restrictive measures in place against Russia in response to its early actions on Ukrainian soil. Those first sanctions were like small warning shots, important but relatively contained. However, when Russia launched its large-scale military operation in Ukraine in February 2022, something fundamental shifted in Britain's strategic mindset. What most people didn't realize at the time was that this event would trigger the largest coordinated economic offensive in modern history, with the UK taking on a leading role that surprised even seasoned observers. The UK, traditionally known for its cautious, measured diplomacy, suddenly took an unexpectedly aggressive stance. Alongside the United States, the European Union, and other G7 nations, London decided to turn its influence over the global financial system into a real weapon of international pressure. This shift marked a fascinating evolution in the very nature of modern geopolitical power. The British decision carried particular weight because of London's unique role as a global financial hub. The City of London processes trillions of dollars in transactions daily, acts as a hub for the euro-dollar market, and hosts some of the largest financial institutions in the world. When the UK decides to use this infrastructure as a pressure tool, the impact is amplified exponentially. Turning this diplomatic approach into a full-scale economic offensive began with a carefully crafted strategy aimed at different layers of the Russian economy. The British plan wasn't just about slapping a few isolated restrictions in place. It was about building a systematic economic siege that would keep tightening over time. The strategy kicked off with something seemingly simple, but devastatingly effective: a massive asset freeze. We're not just talking about a few personal bank accounts here. This was an operation designed to systematically wipe out Russia's access to the international financial system. When you freeze £25 billion in assets from a country, you're basically cutting off its main financial arteries. Imagine trying to run a business when someone just blocked access to a huge chunk of your working capital. Now multiply that across the entire economy of a nation. The process began with obvious targets, the most prominent oligarchs. Roman Abramovich, the famous owner of Chelsea Football Club, saw his UK assets frozen in a move that hit around £12 billion. Oleg Deripaska, the aluminum tycoon, lost access to fortunes estimated in the billions. Alisher Usmanov, a mining and telecoms mogul, had his British investments completely blocked. But the British government didn't stop there. They built a blacklist that grew exponentially over the months, expanding far beyond the well-known oligarchs. The list began to include second- and third-tier executives, family members of sanctioned people, and even so-called facilitators, lawyers, accountants, and consultants who helped structure the complex financial operations of these individuals. This expansion marked a fundamental shift in the philosophy behind sanctions. Instead of just focusing on the most visible figures, the UK started dismantling the entire support network that made it possible for Russia's financial system to function abroad. As that first wave of sanctions started to bite, the UK rolled out a second, even more sophisticated phase: sector-specific restrictions targeting strategic Russian industries. One of these moves was particularly genius, and few analysts saw it coming. Import restrictions on Russian metals, and in a particularly symbolic move, Russian diamonds, were a brilliant strategic decision. This was especially clever because it hit both the practical side of Russia's economy and its international prestige. Russia is one of the world's largest diamond producers, controlling about 25% of global output through its state-owned company, Alrosa. London has long been a crucial hub for trading these precious stones, serving as a gateway for diamonds that eventually reached American, European, and Asian markets. By cutting that link, the UK not only deprived Russia of billions in annual revenue, but also sent a powerful symbolic message. Even the most traditional symbols of luxury and status wouldn't escape the consequences. It was like stripping Russia out of the most exclusive clubs in international trade. The metals decision was equally devastating, but for more practical reasons. Russia is a key supplier of aluminum, nickel, and other industrial metals to the global economy. By restricting these imports, the UK forced British companies to find alternative suppliers, creating long-term pressure on a sector that represents a major source of foreign currency for Moscow. As the first waves of sanctions began showing results, the UK developed even more sophisticated approaches that amounted to real innovations in the art of international economic pressure. One of the most sophisticated and innovative British strategies was the rollout of what they call sanctions against hybrid activities. Officially implemented since October 2024, these measures represent a revolutionary leap in how economic sanctions are thought about. Since October 2024, these measures have targeted activities aimed at undermining electoral processes, sabotaging economic activity, and other operations designed to destabilize European countries. This approach was a fundamental shift because it acknowledged that in today's world, economic and political attacks can be just as devastating as traditional military ones. It was a fascinating evolution in British strategic thinking. Instead of just reacting to traditional military actions, the UK decided to strike preemptively at Russia's ability to meddle politically and economically. It was like they were playing multidimensional chess while others were still stuck on checkers. What makes this approach especially sophisticated is how it anticipates and neutralizes gray zone tactics, actions that sit in the gray area between peace and open conflict. The UK essentially built tools to fight economically against activities that are tough to pin down legally, but that pose real threats to international stability. Alongside hybrid sanctions, the UK developed another devastating tool, the systematic blocking of critical technology exports. This wasn't some improvised move, but a carefully orchestrated strategy aimed at choke points in the Russian economy. The UK specifically banned the sale of specialized chemicals, precision machinery, defense technologies, and dual-use equipment to Russia. This was particularly crippling because Russia's economy relied on these Western imports to keep its industrial and military infrastructure running. Recognizing that having complex rules without a strong enforcement mechanism is like having laws without police, the UK made a crucial institutional decision that showed just how seriously they were taking this economic operation. The announcement of a dedicated agency to enforce trade sanctions wasn't just another routine bureaucratic reshuffle. It was the creation of a true economic task force with a single mission: track, monitor, and punish sanctions violations with surgical precision. This wasn't just organizational change, it was the birth of a real enforcement arm of sanctions, equipped with investigative powers, advanced tech, and legal authority to go after violators across multiple jurisdictions. This agency marked a fundamental shift in the UK's approach, moving from reactive enforcement to proactive sanctions policing. The new agency was structured into specialized departments, one focused on monitoring financial transactions, another dedicated to tracking physical assets like yachts and properties, and a third tackling tech and intellectual property violations. Each unit was kitted out with cutting-edge technology and authority to work alongside similar agencies in other countries. This institutional step showed that the UK viewed its sanctions not as a temporary diplomatic measure, but as a long-term campaign needing sustained resources and specialized expertise. It was like creating a permanent new branch of the national security apparatus, but focused entirely on international economic dominance. The success of Britain's strategy hinged on its ability to coordinate with international partners, building an interconnected sanctions system far harder to dodge than isolated unilateral measures. Coordination with the European Union was especially impressive. The EU rolled out 18 separate sanctions packages, each systematically expanding the number of individuals, entities, and vessels subject to asset freezes, transaction bans, and export restrictions. This steady progression created a denser and denser web of restrictions that became increasingly impossible to maneuver through. As the primary sanctions began to bite, the UK developed one of the most sophisticated and controversial innovations in its strategy: the concept of secondary sanctions hitting third countries and companies. One of the most significant and strategically important evolutions in the British approach was the introduction of broader designation criteria, allowing the UK to sanction foreign individuals and companies with significant exposure to the Russian government or its military-industrial complex. This meant that even companies that weren't Russian but were doing substantial business with Russia could end up sanctioned by the UK. It was like expanding an economic quarantine zone. You don't just isolate the infected person, you also isolate everyone who's had close, meaningful contact with them. This approach proved highly effective because it forced global companies into a binary choice: maintain business ties with Russia or keep access to British, American, and European markets. For most multinational corporations, especially those dependent on the dollar and pound-based international financial system, the choice was obvious. The practical impact was dramatic. Chinese, Indian, Turkish, and other companies began voluntarily pulling out of the Russian market, not because their own governments banned them, but because they couldn't risk losing access to Western markets that made up a far larger share of their global revenues. To truly grasp the scale of what the UK pulled off, we need to look at the hard numbers coming out of this unprecedented economic operation. The official figures reveal staggering scale. Since February 2022, the sanctions imposed by the UK and its allies deprived Russia of more than $400 billion, the equivalent of 4 full years of Russian military spending. This wasn't just some diplomatic inconvenience or administrative headache. It was an economic strike that fundamentally altered Russia's financial and strategic capacities, possibly for good. It was like Russia lost access to an entire national economy overnight. But the numbers become even more striking when you look at the speed of impact. In just 12 months, the UK managed to freeze assets equal to about 15% of Russia's annual GDP. This speed of execution is unprecedented in the modern history of economic sanctions. The impact showed up directly in Russia's fiscal situation in measurable, verifiable ways. The federal budget weakened significantly, with the UK Treasury Committee projecting rising, sustained deficits in the years ahead. Even more importantly, the structure of Russian government revenue was fundamentally altered. Before sanctions, roughly 40% of Russia's government revenue came from energy exports sold at global market prices. With price caps and sectoral sanctions, that share dropped drastically, forcing the Russian government to rely on domestic taxation and drawn-down reserves. The UK Treasury Committee even went so far as to formally warn that Russia was heading into what they technically classified as structural economic deterioration. This wasn't diplomatic language or political hype. It was a technical assessment grounded in rigorous economic models and verifiable financial data. The UK's economic offensive against Russia represents much more than a sophisticated diplomatic response to the events of 2022. It's a definitive case study in how nations can wield modern economic tools to apply international pressure in ways that would have been literally unthinkable just 2 decades ago. The UK showed convincingly that in an era of radical global economic interdependence, true strategic power might lie not in the size of your army or the number of your missiles, but in your ability to control financial, technological, and trade flows that keep the global economy running. That lesson will not go unnoticed by other nations looking for innovative ways to project power in the complex international landscape of the 21st century. This case sets a precedent likely to be studied in military academies, foreign policy think tanks, and economics departments for generations. It's a reminder that in today's interconnected world, the most decisive and strategically important battles may not be fought on physical fields, but in central bank boardrooms, on international payment system servers, in tech development labs, and in the financial corridors of global capitals. And in this new mode of sophisticated economic conflict, the UK proved itself a formidable, creative, and relentlessly effective adversary, an example that reshapes how we think about power, influence, and strategy in the 21st century geopolitical game.